So, welcome to my inaugural Don't Follow the Shepherd podcast. There's a lot of nuance there in regard to the name, and we'll talk about it in the future. But I'm so glad to have a good friend on here who gets me in many ways, and I get him. We both have eclectic backgrounds and a passion for animals. So, with no further ado, I suppose they say, welcome, Michael Robison.
Yeah, man.
Back up so you can see the logo of his monkey rescue. How many primates are in private hands these days? What's the issue
Yeah.
with the non-human primate trade as you're concerned?
Yeah, that's a really good it's really a good question that I don't think we really know the answer to. Currently, the federal agencies that do at least track a little bit of what they think is out there, they're roughly between 14 and 15,000 that they can definitively say are in captivity here in the United States in private ownership. Those are kind of the estimated numbers. I can say this, and specifically, I've got Winston with me, one of our Mexican spider monkeys, which is really the bulk of what we do because they're one of the more commonly imported animals into the exotics trade here in the U.S. But in just the last 4 years, I've tracked over 500 of these guys that have been illegally smuggled into the illegal side or the non-registered side of the pet trade here in the United States. So if I had to guess, Jordan, I would say that we probably have between 25 and 30,000, probably twice the number of animals that the federal government or the agencies that kind of pay attention to this, the watchdogs per se, are watching because, again, just this week, I helped point Border Patrol and Department of Natural Resources towards a couple of very illicit smugglers and sellers who are bringing in, and that alone accounted for an additional 30 animals just in the last week. So there's a big, it's really hard.
Yeah,
To
you
really
don't even have to
estimate.
put a number on it. I mean, the interesting thing is, and I talked to you about this before, there was a study I think we discussed the stress of animal care providers in shelters, in zoos, in captivity at large is being studied more and more. The recognized mental health issues, um, physical concerns. This isn't to condemn any of those, but to say they're overloaded. Zoos had
Right.
focused on endangered species, and now they're opening their doors to more rescues. There are
Correct.
some conservation parks that I know, uh, accredited and non-accredited, who have worked to kind of become more hybridized, if you will. They both
Yeah.
ran conservation breeding programs at the same time. They open their doors to rescues. For example, and I'll go back to your specific work,
Yeah.
but there's so many orphan bears in the world. We don't think of
Right.
orphan grizzly bears as in terms of numbers. If we wanted to save all of them, there's no room, right? So
Right.
it's a little different with the exotic pet trade, and with regard to spider monkeys in particular. There's such a volume, and there's a need. They're among, I don't like to put a label on the highly intelligent New World monkey, but spider monkeys are that, right?
Yes.
And they need huge social groups. And you offer something that's beautiful because if someone goes to your Instagram, they see Winston and your other members of your non-human primate family in loose social groups, just like you would see them in the wild. In the
Correct.
home, you share the home. You don't dedicate necessarily space, although you have dedicated facility.
Right.
So let's talk about maybe the social and emotional needs of these primates because they get attached to their caregivers as much as each other. And the irony is that these sentient species, the sentient taxa, they need as much um, support from their caregivers. In other words, you've got this uh, cognitively sophisticated primate, non-human primate, and so its needs are greater, but it's also one of the more common ones in captivity.
Right.
So dealing
Absolutely.
with that. Sorry, I'm
Yeah,
rambling.
it is. No, and I think that really is an interesting way to put it. And of course, I appreciate it because you come at this not just from someone who cares about the animals, but someone whose big chunk of your professional life was in the zoology space, right? So it's a lived professional reality for you as well. It's interesting today. I was sent a clip, and I knew the series was coming out, but there's a bunch of them. But the Americas, this new series that NBC has put together, kind of nature series, kind of the knockoff of the David Attenborough stuff that Tom Hanks is narrating, and they were covering Mexico. So in this past episode that aired this last, I think it was Sunday evening, they covered the spider monkeys. And one of the things, I think this was just really timely that this popped up for me today, because I say this a lot. I try to give people the facts and the figures about the reality of these guys right here. Winston's been with me. He was probably a month old when he came to us. A broker who had gotten into trouble. We got a call and went to pick him up, and he was the first baby I'd ever raised. I'd worked around him. My background working in veterinary medicine as a technician and working specifically with the Nashville Zoo here 30 years ago. I worked with them, but I did not raise them. I didn't share my life with them. One of the things that they talked about in the America series, they talked about the spider monkeys and how spider monkeys in particular, when they're young, they're attached to their mother for 2 years in general in the wild, and it's that social component. So when you've got an animal that's been taken from its mother, when it's been poached and or bred, which is it's more rare for them to breed in captivity, but if it's been poached, their biology, their sentient biology and psychology, mental needs, everything are hardwired for that 2 year period of codependence, right? So as caregivers, whether you are a private owner or whether you're someone like me who takes in animals and rescue, those first 2 years are really important to give them a healthy foundation, right? And they attach to you. They just have a natural reality. What we see in the pet trade that's really unique is that obviously, and you could talk about this from a zoological standpoint, a veterinary standpoint, but these guys start to reach maturity between 2 and 4 years. So by the time they start to gain more of that independence, they bonded tightly to you. But of course, natural instincts come into play, behavior patterns. They're wild animals. They're not domesticated. Even though they're in a domestic situation, they're not domesticated. And I think that's a big distinction that often gets blurred when we talk about pets, when we talk about, different things. These aren't animals that have been bred in captivity for thousands of years. They've been imported from the wild for display or personal ownership in captivity. So you don't have domesticated instinctual traits that exist. So what happens often in the private trade is that by the time they reach that 2 to 4 year window, people are not prepared for those wild natural behaviors. And so they tend to rehome them. And when you talk about the mental and emotional needs of a sentient animal like a primate, and specifically a highly intelligent primate like a spider monkey, you end up with issues when they get rehomed of reactive attachment disorders. And it's very similar. I have 7 children, 4 of which are adopted, and 2 through foster care, who have very traumatic backgrounds. And it's really been an interesting study to me as an observer to see some of the same behavior patterns in these animals that I saw in my children as they were growing up. And the ability where they want to trust, they're wired, I mean, they're hardwired deep as animals whose entire social structure is built on trust. And when they're in an upheaval mode, when they're constantly passed from one owner to the next or one facility to the next, there's a lot of stress that goes into that. We here recently in the last month took in 3 additional spider monkeys, all within the age range of 3 to 4, which is the very common age that you start to see them being handed off, because those behavior patterns change. They act more like the wild animal that they are. And, within the first week that those 3 were here, I found myself getting bitten, which is a reality of working with wild animals. Injury comes with that. There's a stress level because the animal is stressed. You're stressed because you don't want to inhibit behaviors that cause fear or, anything that might break the possibility of a foundation of trust with these animals. And so you find yourself in this constant tension. And of course, our human nature is we want to resolve tensions. We have to also recognize that in life, many tensions are just meant to be managed versus resolved. And so you find yourself in this constant back and forth. But as you feel that stress, because they're such a sentient being, they also feel that stress, as does any living creature. We transfer our energy back and forth on a consistent basis. But because they are wired very much like we are from a psychological standpoint, they feed off of that. And so we feed each other. And in so many ways, as a caregiver, specifically to primates, I find myself constantly having to remind myself this is just like when my children were 3, 4, 5 years old, because their cognitive ability, their emotional state is so similar to roughly about a 5-year-old child. And so there is a high stress level in there. And these guys, like you say, you worked with the Alaskan grizzly bears. Bears are extremely sentient, emotional creatures. Elephants. There's so many of these animals that are in curated zoological settings who are dependent on their caregivers. The caregiver's emotionally tied. There's just a lot of emotional stressors that are involved in that. And then there's just if we're caring human beings, and the good caregivers, I think, obviously experience more of the burnout than anybody else. Somebody who's just punching a clock and feeding an animal and shoveling poop and cleaning enclosures and all that kind of stuff, it's a job. But for those of us who pour our lives into it, there's a deep emotional stress that comes with it, and we do experience burnout. And there are definitely days when you're taking care of humanized primates where I get up and I'm like, man, I got to do all this today again. It's like, this is not easy work. And I think about it too. Again, I draw a lot of parallels as a parent. I spent 20 something years raising my children who are slowly but surely all becoming adults now, thinking I made it. I did it as a parent, but really as a caregiver for these primates, the rest of my life will be living in that perpetual state of setting a foundation, of giving emotional guidance, security, stability, reassuring trust, and then enduring when my trust is broken between them, or when you get, you care about these animals and one has a day where the hormones are out of sort, or the troop is stressed and you get bitten, or they tear something up, or you can't control the situation, and your own internal thing goes, man, I'm not doing a good enough job, or they don't like me anymore, or all of those different components play in, and it plays on both sides. And I think, again, with primates, I think they are, to me anyway, they're specifically unique amongst most of the animal kingdom in the sense that they resemble us so much. We build a stronger emotional bond between ourselves and these particular animals.
Yeah, I mean, you brought up some really interesting things because um, the public is inundated with imagery and videos of people with animals. Um,
Yes,
they don't necessarily think of the human animal bond as being different across an array of spectrum of circumstances. So
right,
you're right. Like when I worked in the the zoological parks, we had moved away from hand rearing animals because we
right.
realized we were creating neurotic animals. And so
Sure.
keeping animals with their parent was a foundational part of the programming for these conservation breeding
Sure.
efforts, right? But many people had very limited experience hand rearing various species. I've worked with lots of spider monkeys, but I was not hand rearing most of them for
Right,
sure, right? And so it's a completely different experience. So exploring the human animal bond, understanding our own attachment traumas as humans, the sensitivities of working with these animals, it's
right,
a whole different art and science. The animal world is a big field, but there are different segments. This isn't judging one over another, but you know, some people don't know to ask the right questions. For example, have you worked with spider monkeys? For example, have you raised a spider monkey?
right,
What age was it when you got it? Uh,
right,
and this is true for people in the animal training field. If they raised an animal that was born in captivity, it's going to be completely different than something that comes in,
right,
and depending on what age. These are things that people don't often consider, and it's hard to curate your experience viewing stuff online and learning unless you talk to somebody like you.
right,
So there will even be skeptics who see you with a monkey here and say, oh, that guy's got a monkey, he's a pet owner, blah blah. No, you have to explore the story,
right.
understand the role that you do. Now, can you talk a little bit about the mission of Spartan and where
Yes.
you want to go?
Yeah, absolutely. So these guys, I mean, Winston is the kind of core foundation of what Spartan turned into. When I stepped back into the space, I ended up not pursuing a career in zoology. But when I sold my company almost 6 years ago, I stepped back into the space of kind of volunteering, serving, helping to fundraise, bring groups together to support specifically in exotic animals because I saw the need. The laws are changing drastically in the United States, so ownership is not really an option, but there are a lot of animals here who then don't have a lot of options. Whether it's sanctuaries are full, zoos have certain regulations where they're not, they can or cannot accept certain animals under certain circumstances. So you've got this big, wide gap of these creatures, and it's not just the monkeys. I mean, we have all kinds of other critters here too, large giant pythons and boas and tortoises and wallabies and armadillos and all kinds of just odds and ends that we care for. But specifically with the monkeys, because these are animals that live generally anywhere from 30 up to 50 years in captivity. So it's an extremely long lifespan as a general rule with captive primates. And so you've got a long window of caregiving that has to be given. These animals, I mean, Winston on average, I say this often, I try so hard through social media to educate. What's interesting is social media really does not allow you to share the hard stuff, right? They let you share the cute stuff, the kitschy stuff, that whatever gets views, right? Although I swear to you, if I could just show myself getting bitten a few times on there, it would get just as many views. It's just interesting how it's interpreted. But the reality is that this is an animal that it'll average during the year, care for these animals. I'd say anywhere from ten to $15,000. So it's not a whole lot different than raising a human child, right? It's a high cost of care to provide for them. And when you multiply that over 3 or 4 decades, it adds up pretty quickly, right? So, sanctuaries and zoological parks aren't necessarily always granted the right amount of funding or donorship to support a large population of these animals. And when you have a large population, so when we first came into being, part of it was we just saw the gap, right? We saw that there's sanctuaries that don't have the funding. We could just be another part of that network to provide for however many we're able to give them long-term care and fill the gap again where zoological parks, the registered or accredited zoological parks are not allowed to just pick up an animal from a private owner these days, right? And provide them care. And so, we felt like we could step into that place. What we found, though, is that we've got a unique space to educate in a different way because we're not bound by the same regulations as an accredited facility where, certain boundaries of no contact and no interaction with the animals. Again, uniquely, these are animals that were raised in somebody's home. So they've got 2 or 3 years of hard programming in who they are. And it's just like taking a child. When you move them into a different environment, certain things just never change. I have a daughter she just turned 14. She grew up in an orphanage the first 4 years of her life. There are certain behavior patterns in her that don't match any of my other children. And she has a reactive attachment disorder that's very unique because in an orphanage where people would come in and visit and she would get short doses of attention and affection, she was hardwired for 4 years to accept short doses and feel like that was sufficient. So, but she also wasn't used to being coddled or held or loved on the same. So it's interesting. I say often, here she is at 14. If I go sit down next to her on the couch and put my arm around her, she'll look me straight in the eye and go, "Why are you touching me?" Like she doesn't have a trauma attached to that. She has a hardwired programming the first 4 years of her life that's just not how you do things. And this the same thing is going to apply to these particular animals. And so we want to provide an environment that gives them a mix, right? Where they still get that human interaction, they still get the care. So we maintain a foundation for them, but we also, like you said, we build that loose, open troop structure for them in community where they have each other. They're able to dynamically interact with one another. They have space to be both inside, outside, natural environment, digging in the dirt, doing all the things that they would do, climbing very large, tall enclosures to give them that room to move freely. And so we try to provide them that space and then use that to educate the public in as much as possible. So Spartan exists in that way. What I do believe is a unique thing is I know personally, as many people do have worked with these animals, and I actually have had this discussion here recently with one of the keepers at the Nashville Zoo. is that working with the primates in particular, there's something really unique about the human and primate, non-human primate interaction that is just a unique, it's a soul centering reality. And I hope that we're able to bring some of that back into the mix. Because again, you have a large population of animals who also benefit just as much as we do from that relational interaction, and to demonstrate to folks around us. I know Winston in particular, along with a couple of others, my grandfather has dementia, and so he will often visit to my grandfather, and that interaction with an animal brings a little something magic back to someone who's walking through something that is a mental block or barrier for them. And so I believe that there are ways that we can demonstrate that back to the world to show that the value of the animal is not just a neat, cool pet, not just a neat display, not just clicks on social media, but rather there's a mutually beneficial relationship between ourselves and the animals that we're able to work with.
Yeah, you and I have talked a lot about messaging and exploring how people consume this stuff on social media is so important because that's where they're seeing most of it. There's just tons of it. And it's not like, back in the day when uh, I would have perhaps been interested prior to even working in the field, if you will. I didn't have access to just, see much of this stuff. There were documentaries, but exploring raw footage of the human animal interaction and the human animal bond and conflict.
Yeah.
Those were things that weren't so readily accessible. And there needs to be some way to um, kind of curate this content or at least help people understand what they're looking at. Uh, it's like many other things in the social media world. They need to be able to kind of help people.
Well, it's an interesting because I think that Nem Chimpsky, the
Oh,
the chimp that was studying, I think this was probably the last time there was a real attempt at showing some of that when this was a university study and they tried like crazy to overly humanize this chimp, only to come to the realization about 7 years into the study, like this doesn't work. There is that conflict of the animal world and the human world. While there's a confluence, there's not an alignment, right? So
right.
there's a reality that we interact, we can intersect with each other, but we have to respect those differences too. But in respecting those differences, we have these incredible experiences for ourselves and same for the animals. Again, it's mutually beneficial. Often we get the argument, oh, these animals would be so much better in their natural environment. Well, yes, that is a true statement, but they're not. And what often is not also said in that same breath is that once certain animals, there are some animals you can absolutely quote, rehabilitate and introduce into a semi-natural environment. However, again, you've got these animals, with the spider monkey, their mothers, when they're on them for 2 years, teach them like, hey, if you're sick, eat this, it'll make it better. Or don't eat that because you're going to get sick. This is the predator. That's not. It's like those certain things that, again, just the same way we're taught by our parents. Like this is good, this is bad, this is smart, this is stupid. Those sort of things. They're not given those natural things. So they don't have some of those teachings to help them survive well in a wild environment. Not to mention there's so many intricacies to this, right? Is that you can't just take this animal and rehabilitate it and say, here's your canopy of trees in a rainforest and the Yucatan Peninsula, go and live. They don't know to evade the boa constrictors that are in the trees that are one of their number one predators, right? It's not, they may have a natural fear of it, but they don't know that there's a reason for that natural fear because they never watched one of their troop be eaten by that animal and they didn't experience it. But there's also things that are even further intricacies, and we see this with the smuggling side, is that they're just the natural biome of us as individuals, as living creatures on this planet. Our environment determines a big chunk of our biome, what bacteria, parasites, things like that our body has adapted to or carries with it naturally that may or may not affect us. And then when you change your outer environment, you may negatively impact that internal biome. So we see this with a lot of the imported monkeys that come in that show no health signs, but within a week or two of being in our fluoride and rich water supply here in the United States, chemically treated foods, different things like that activate different responses of viral, bacterial, parasitic responses inside the animals. And that's why we see a lot of these young animals that are imported from other countries don't make it in our environment. The same would be true in reverse. You take this animal and you put it back in the rainforest, it's exposed to different things that it's not built a natural immunity to. And so there are all these intricacies that when you look at the studies of primates that have been rehabilitated, like 80, I think it's like 86% don't make it past 90 days being reintroduced into the wild, whether they're succumbing to, infections, prey, or food scarcity because they don't know how to forage the same way. And
Yeah,
so there's so much.
yeah, the reintroduction biology is very interesting. I know the San Diego Zoo is leading many projects in that space and really studying that field. I mean, I even remember working with bison, right?
Right.
Bison, we hard released or soft released animals into nature, and to think that we even had challenges in that regard, then you
Right.
understand that reintroducing anything to try and acclimate it to nature, from marine mammals to primates, is really tough stuff.
Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to mention is that when you go to a developing country and you see the interactions between animals and people at for lack of a better term, the urban interface,
Sure.
uh, where regulations may not be as strong, there are people that have grown their whole life, that have lived their whole lives, where they occasionally would encounter wild animals that have created, have some kind of relationship, right?
Yep.
I mean,
Exactly.
these are oddities, but we don't talk about that because we
Right.
so carefully try to avoid, and understandably so, human wildlife conflict. But it's a very interesting paradigm to look at, the various circumstances across the
Right.
spectrum of human animal interactions, from
Yes.
pet to rescue and rehabilitation, which is
Right.
what you do, to conservation breeding, which is also a different focus. So anyways, well, thank you so much. It's you know we talk all the time, but I wanted to
Yeah.
share some of this, and I'm glad to see Winston. And what is the Instagram for Winston? I love
It is.
a
Yeah,
couple
it's
of them.
Spider Monkey Winston. So
Spider
we kept it really.
Okay.
My kids are the ones who started that whole thing. They're like, Dad, you gotta share this. It's so cool, And I was like, I don't know, we did, and I'll be darned. And he's back here jumping on the bed, literally. The monkey's jumping on the bed. But they wanted to share it, and it's so funny because we went viral, which was never the intention. It's both a thorn in my side and a blessing at the same time because it opens you up to lots of opinions and, yeah, eyeballs that sometimes you don't want. But it's a great place, and I try. The way I have to share the real stuff is we do it through talking head videos. I can't show it. Unfortunately, we tried a million times to share the hard content. I put a video up yesterday. I was out back checking on them. They're out in their outdoor enclosure and playing and everything. So I'm talking to them. I just taking food and water out and checking on everybody. I'm standing there and I start getting peed on from overhead because one of them climbs to the top of the enclosure just right over me and he starts peeing on me. And you're like, it just is what it is, So I try to show a glimpse of all those different sides. And again, people can watch. We try to share the diet, how complex that is and how much work goes into it and how the volume that goes into it for the troop of spider monkeys in particular. But additionally, just trying to show like the amount of enrichment that goes into it, the amount of time and effort that goes into cleaning and care and attention and all those sorts of things. So we do our best within those boundaries. And then, again, through SPARTN, we do a lot of educational stuff we've done it with universities, with schools, with other nonprofit organizations where we take the animals there as ambassadors and really open up and have conversations like this where we go, let's talk about the complexities. It stays at that surface level often when we stay just online. And so we try to, really educate and help folks take a deeper look.
But I think it's also eye-opening for I'm distanced from the field, but I think it's eye-opening for animal husbandry personnel at the leading conservation centers to see what you do, because they're not interacting the same way. And
Sure.
there's something to be learned I'm not saying that, to encourage people to try and copy or emulate, but even the animal husbandry professionals can benefit from some of the enrichment
Sure.
protocols that you present. Um,
Well, here's an interesting thing. You'll appreciate this. One of the primary, I guess he's a rep, but he's a representative of Missouri that makes all the pet foods and things like that. But they're specifically really one of the top manufacturer of monkey biscuits and processed monkey diet, which we don't actually feed a lot of here. I'm not a big fan because I do think there's a lot of junk in that. And I don't think it mimics a natural diet. But it's interesting. He called me one day and he said, I appreciate that you show the food prep and all this. He said, I would suggest you give them this particular product. He goes, it'll change cage aggression, which again, that's something that you deal with in the zoological and captive animal space. And I told him, I said, I have zero cage aggression. And I think part of that is I give them a balanced diet with the proper amount of enrichment. And, I have 11 that live together in a relatively small space, certainly nothing close to their natural environment, right? They would have multiple miles of square footage of rainforest movement. And I just don't deal with cage aggression. I don't deal with those things. So it's interesting. He leaned in and asked a lot of questions. He came back. He said, "Gosh, I guess I can't really say the cage aggression thing anymore because you've proven me." And I said, "But that's the thing is, I'm also willing to hear him and say, why do you feel it provides that? Because we have to be students with each other, which is part of what you were just saying is that observation between these different spaces. Because obviously, the American Zoological Association has protocol for the way they work with their animals. They have their reasonings for it, good, bad, or indifferent. The sanctuary spaces, depending on how you're accredited, has a similar or variants of those set of rules. And of course, those of us in private care and private sanctuary, we're not really governed by a set of auspices. We have to educate ourselves. We have to learn. So I try to find myself being a student. I went and spent some time at the Indianapolis Zoo with Bill Street and some of those guys up there, and got to be hands-on in their primate facility and learn some of the things that they do. And it was really good for me because again, I live it every day, but I live it from a different standpoint. So what can I learn from someone else? And that's what I hope. I talk to the keepers here at the Nashville Zoo often. They've had one of the very few spider monkeys that was born in the zoological program in the last few years because spider monkeys, again, it's this whole deep conversation, don't breed well in captivity. Partially because they imprint so much to their caregivers, they don't imprint enough to each other to create that bond for breeding. But it's interesting because that little 2-year-old that they have there now is very interactive with me when I'm at the exhibit and talks to me. And I said, somebody's been very, very hands-on with this monkey. I said, I know you can't admit it, but somebody's been very caring to this animal in ways that they haven't with the other animals in that exhibit. And it's so funny because it was at the exhibit that day, and the caregiver goes, no, 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 we don't do that. I said, listen, I live with these animals. I know I can talk their language. Like I can literally see it and interpret. And it's okay. I'm not like, it's not to out anybody. I realized I think you've done well by it. It's not a statement of anything other than I really appreciate it. I can see the value of it. And so, that ability to learn from each other and identify. And again, as you know, any program that you've worked in closely with an animal for a period of time, you pick up on nuances and we do. I often scratch my head and go, what if? I constantly have to put myself in a position where the primary troop that I care for here are all 6 years and under. So they're just reaching adulthood and that age of maturity. There's a chance in 10 years that I don't touch these animals ever again because they become so independent. I also, as a caregiver, have to be prepared that my relationship changes with these animals because their dynamic changes. And so it requires us to be students and learn from each
Yeah,
other.
that's another great point. There's a grieving period, I suppose. I mean, people work with large carnivores, and again,
Yes.
I'm not endorsing the hands-on work or not. I'm just saying that you spend days every day working closely with a tractable animal, and
Right.
then maybe something happens, and you realize um, this is something you can't do anymore, and
Right.
it's a grieving period. Now, again, zoos understandably prohibit that, and it's dangerous. But I think we're we're seeing more of the lines are being blurred a little bit because there's
Yeah.
a need for more caretakers for this population of spider monkeys that you're just talking
Right.
about, right?
Right.
And you can't learn what you did in a day. Like as
Right.
an expert doing this every day, you have an opportunity to teach others, but it's a huge time investment. So,
Right.
but we have to honor what you do, and thank God actually for social media that there's an opportunity. I mean, there's some certainly negatives, but there's some
Sure.
great opportunity for you to showcase things that people wouldn't otherwise get exposed to. So thank
Exactly.
you very much. I know we'll continue our conversations. I'll probably want to have you back on as soon as
Sure.
possible if time permits. But thank you for being on this inaugural episode, if you will.
Absolutely.
And I hope you like my graphics, by the
I
way.
do. I
I
love
got
it. You did
spider
great, man.
monkeys up there.
I
I had
love it.
fun
It's
with that.
fantastic.
I had fun with that. All right. Well, we'll talk soon. Thanks.
All right.
Bye.